January 28, 1986. You are standing on the edge of the launch complex at the Kennedy Space Center. The tropical air is not warm today. It is a thin, metallic cold, carrying the sting of salt and a fierce Atlantic wind. A NASA photographer kneels on the asphalt, lining up the most important picture of his career. His subjects stand against the backdrop of the Shuttle Challenger, a majestic tower of white and grey reaching into the pale sky. The photographer raises his camera, and the lens finds its focus. The flash freezes the moment. 7 smiles in bright blue flight suits, standing close, unified, sharing 7 distinct smiles. This is the ultimate portrait of American ambition. You see Mission Commander Francis Scobie. You see Krista McAuliffe, the civilian, the schoolteacher, whose presence promised spaceflight belonged to everyone. This photograph was meant to be the symbol of victory, the visual proof of an unstoppable space program. But within 73 seconds from liftoff, those 7 smiles would vanish, ripped apart in a cloud of black smoke high above the ocean. This photo wasn't taken after a triumph. It was taken minutes before the most devastating lesson in American history. It became the final, silent piece of evidence of a system that knew the risk but launched anyway. This photograph, meant to inspire, would instead become the ultimate testament to a tragedy that should have been prevented. NASA in the 1980s was flying high. 24 successful shuttle missions had already launched and returned, each one cementing the idea that this powerful machine was now routine. It was no longer a pioneering experiment, it was the space truck of the future. This atmosphere bred overconfidence, but far from the launch pad, inside the production facilities of Morton Thiokol, a different reality was taking shape. These engineers, the specialized corps responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, were becoming increasingly alarmed. Their concerns focused on the O-rings, 2 massive rubber seals vital for preventing exhaust gases from escaping the booster joints. The engineers possessed clear data. In temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the rubber seals lost their elasticity and became hard. They simply could not expand quickly enough to fill the gap created by the booster's ignition. Their analysis showed a critical vulnerability. This is the central conflict of the story. The engineering team, using rigorous data, understood the physics. The administration, however, treated photography as a tool for creating an image of invincibility. This demand for a public-facing image, one of unyielding confidence, meant every single objection to the cold weather launch was treated as an obstacle, a weakness, or an enemy of the schedule. The smiles in that last photograph, the one that ran in newspapers worldwide that same morning. It wasn't just confidence, it was the face of pressure, a mask that hid a deep, ignored fear. The walkout was a scene of manufactured joy. Wind was gusting hard across Launch Complex 39B, making the large American flag snap with a sound like a starting pistol. The air was so cold you could see the photographer's breath plume out in quick, white puffs, despite the growing sunlight. They lined the tarmac as the crew of 7 emerged. It was a ritual of celebrity and hope, a flash, a salute, a final wave from the command pilot. Every click of a camera shutter sealed the crew's confident image into history. In one of the final seconds before the crew entered the lift, a NASA photographer managed one last handshake, a final grin. He quickly withdrew from the scene. The reel of film, specifically labeled STS-51L crew departure, was immediately removed from the camera. This small, cold canister, containing the last living image of the 7 astronauts, was then carefully placed into a courier's case. It was the last physical photo taken before liftoff, a concrete object now carrying the unbearable emotional dissonance of a celebration masking quiet dread. The film roll was rushed away from the launch pad, preserving the final moments of normalcy just as the clock ticked down to the final, fatal sequence. On the same morning that smiling photo was rushed to the press, the fight to stop the launch reached its frantic climax. Engineers again pleaded for a delay. Their data was a clear, cold warning. The O-rings were compromised. Their charts showed the seals would lose critical elasticity at temperatures below 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature on the launch pad that morning was 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineers, including Roger Boisjoli, spoke with a trembling voice during a teleconference, arguing that the seals were simply frozen and would not expand to meet the sudden, violent force of ignition. The leadership, however, saw charts, not catastrophe. They had a schedule, a global audience, and a relentless pressure to maintain the image of NASA's infallibility. The anomaly was not a failing part. The anomaly was the truth. While the engineers were ignored, the photo ran in every major newspaper, the perfect image of American confidence. This was the defining contradiction of the event: frozen smiles versus frozen seals. The crew's happy compliance, framed by the camera, became the visual alibi for the technical danger concealed within the data. The objective, physical truth was dismissed as an administrative inconvenience, clearing the path for the shuttle to take off and deliver the final, shocking verdict on a system that prioritized image over integrity. The tragedy had occurred, but the investigation was just beginning. In the aftermath of the explosion, the very first piece of evidence brought into the hearing rooms was that final, simple photograph. NASA's Public Relations Department insisted on the interpretation the public needed to hear. They looked happy. They looked confident. They trusted the system. But the engineers and forensic psychologists brought in to review the evidence saw something far more disturbing when they viewed the high-resolution prints. They didn't see courage. They saw compliance. The experts looked past the broad official grins and analyzed the micro-expressions. They noted the forced nature of the smiles, the subtle tension around the eyes, the collective stiffness in the shoulders. These were the psychological markers of human beings under immense professional pressure, obligated to project confidence while privately holding a reservation. The true story of the crew's final moments was written not in their words, but in their bodies, captured by the flash of a single camera. An investigator, working with mission telemetry, developed a chilling overlay technique. He projected the smiling photograph onto a screen, establishing the final moment of certainty, T-0. Then, next to it, he projected the official launch timeline. He detailed the sequence of events that the crew had faced in the seconds after the photo was taken, once the cockpit door had sealed and the countdown was irreversible. The comparison was devastating. He pointed to the faces, then to the clock. T-0, smiling photo. And then he jumped forward to the crucial moment of structural breakup, T plus 73 seconds. In the span of just over 1 minute, the hopeful promise of the photo was violently contradicted by the laws of physics. The image, once a tool of propaganda, now served as a relentless time-stamped anchor for the tragedy. The photo did not just record the crew's expression, it recorded the institutional state of mind that allowed the launch. The investigation realized the smiling faces were the human manifestation of the same willful optimism that had dismissed the engineers' cold, hard numbers. The image became a forensic tool, forcing investigators to confront the emotional pressure placed upon every person in the chain of command. The true horror of the briefing scene was the realization that the system had not only failed to protect the crew, it had demanded they participate in their own image of certain success. The smiles were the final act of obedience, a silent testimony to the cost of prioritizing image over information. This realization turned the investigation away from technical failure and directly toward managerial and psychological accountability. The photo was the evidence, and the 73 seconds were the indictment. The question at the heart of the subsequent hearings was simple. Was the photo's smiling confidence justified, or was the engineer's fear correct? The investigators had the data, but now they needed proof. They needed to demonstrate, beyond a doubt, that the frozen O-rings were the single point of failure that the smiling photograph had so effectively obscured. Engineers rebuilt the booster joints. They rigged them with high-speed cameras and subjected them to the exact conditions of the January morning launch. This was the ultimate verification step, testing the hypothesis of failure. They refrigerated the test joints, chilling the seals down to the 36 degrees Fahrenheit pad temperature. Then, they simulated the internal pressure surge of ignition. The result was instantaneous and conclusive. The high-speed footage was brutal. It showed precisely what the Thiokol engineers had warned about. The cold seals, brittle and rigid, failed to seat properly. They failed to plug the gap. Within milliseconds, a burst of black exhaust gas, the same ominous plume seen in the real launch footage, escaped through the compromised joint. The cameras captured the seal failing to close, the rubber remaining hard and inelastic, a clear failure of engineering under environmental stress. This single, irrefutable test demonstrated that the catastrophe was not a freak accident. It was the direct, measurable consequence of ignoring the data. The investigators realized the tragic irony of the situation. The launch team didn't need a new photograph, a new hero, or a new piece of technology to prevent the disaster. They didn't need another staged portrait of confidence. They needed only the courage to look differently at the old one. The truth wasn't hidden in some esoteric calculation. It was clearly documented in the engineering charts and confirmed now by forensic video evidence. The engineers had been right all along. The high-speed test footage became the final, undeniable validation of the original warning. The same distinct plume of black smoke, the same brief, horrifying flash of escaping flame appeared in the test footage as it had in the disaster film. The scientists realized that the truth was never about what they didn't know. It was about the reality they had deliberately avoided. The investigation concluded that the data had not only existed, it had been buried beneath an administrative compulsion to keep the launch schedule inviolate. The trial confirmed the hypothesis. The smiles in the photo were simply the last image of an organization choosing public relations over physical reality. The long, technical hearings of the Rogers Commission had been exhaustive, but they lacked a single, shattering moment of visual truth. Charts, graphs, and complex thermal elasticity models had been presented. But the problem that sank the Challenger, the failure of a tiny O-ring, was too easily buried under technical jargon and bureaucratic layers. The public was confused. NASA still controlled the narrative of complexity. That was until Richard Feynman stepped forward. Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and commission member, was famously impatient with obfuscation. He understood that the truth often requires simplicity, not complexity. He knew the problem had to be pulled from the abstract world of engineering reports and presented as undeniable physical reality. He prepared a single, brilliant demonstration. He walked to the front of the hearing room, a plain, water-glass tumbler in his hand. The hearing was televised, and the entire nation watched. He held up a small section of the O-ring material, a piece of rubber seal just a few inches long. Then, without fanfare, he ordered a glass of ice water. In front of the silent watching commission, Feynman took a pair of pliers, plucked from a local hardware store that morning, and clamped the rubber O-ring material, simulating the compression it endured inside the booster joint. He then gently lowered the material, still clamped, into the glass of ice water. He explained that the temperature of that water was 32 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature higher than the seals experienced on the 36 degrees Fahrenheit launch pad that morning. He continued talking, explaining the function of the seals, allowing the rubber material time to cool and become brittle. He spoke directly to the public, simplifying the physics of elasticity, refusing to use a single acronym or piece of jargon. He let the silent, simple physics of the glass and the ice do the work. After several minutes, he pulled the material from the water. It was stiff, almost frozen. He carefully removed the pliers, releasing the compression. The rubber material, deprived of its resilience by the cold, failed to spring back. It maintained the flattened shape of the compressed seal, leaving a visible tiny gap where a perfect seal was required. He held the unsealed rubber up for the cameras to see. He then delivered his quiet, devastating conclusion. "I took this stuff that I got out of your seal," he stated, his voice calm, "and I put it in ice water, and I discovered that, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there's no resilience in this particular material when it's at a temperature of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe that has some significance for our problem." The public had waited 6 weeks for the truth. They got it in a matter of seconds, proven by a glass of ice water. This single act cut through the months of denial and the years of bureaucratic mismanagement. The silent truth, the one that the engineers had desperately tried to convey through charts and memos, was finally visible. The smiling photograph that had covered the newspapers was instantly relegated to the archive. The simple, visible crack in the frozen rubber became the definitive symbol of the disaster. The demonstration was the visual and emotional spike the narrative needed. It took the most technical piece of evidence, polymer failure, and made it utterly undeniable. The irony was complete. NASA had concealed the truth with a staged photograph, and now the truth was revealed through a demonstration that used a simple glass of water and the most basic properties of matter. The system was exposed. The smiling photo was projected onto the back wall of the hearing room as a silent indictment. Then, the screen faded to black. The ice water demonstration by Feynman changed everything. The truth was no longer a matter of engineering charts or managerial opinion. It was a visible, physical fact. The findings of the Rogers Commission were not limited to the O-rings. They were an indictment of the culture that let the launch proceed. The report diagnosed an organizational failure, identifying a fatal breakdown in communication between the engineers, who possessed the data, and the managers, who controlled the schedule. The central lesson diffused across the entire aerospace industry: never again will image take priority over information. The institutional change was sweeping and mandatory. NASA reformed its entire safety and reporting structure, establishing new channels specifically designed to protect engineers who raised concerns. These channels ensured that technical objections could no longer be overridden by mid-level managers fixated on political deadlines. The entire process of reviewing waivers and technical exceptions was revamped, imposing a far higher standard for risk acceptance. The greatest scale-up of this lesson was the culture shift itself. Every single component in the Space Shuttle program, from the main engines down to the smallest bolt, was put through a rigorous, unforgiving review process. The grounding of the shuttle fleet became a necessary penance. The vehicle that was once seen as routine was now acknowledged as a machine of inherent deadly risk. The agency spent the next 32 months focused on safety, reliability, and accountability. The single photo of the smiling astronauts, once a tool of public relations, had become the ultimate warning. It was no longer hung on the walls of administration buildings to celebrate the crew. It was placed in the agency's archives, a relic not of courage, but of a catastrophic, institutional blindness. The smiles represented the moment before the fall, a constant, silent reminder that complacency kills. This new culture, built upon the ruins of the Challenger, prioritized the discomfort of truth over the comfort of the schedule. The goal was to ensure that future mission commanders, when they looked out the window before liftoff, saw not the faces of confident managers, but the unquestionable proof of their machine's readiness. The agency learned that the most critical safety device was not in the shuttle. It was in the unfiltered flow of information. The strategic impact of that single catastrophic failure went far beyond the loss of 7 lives. It initiated the most profound and expensive system shock in NASA's history. The illusion of routine was shattered, and the true price of managerial arrogance was calculated in staggering numbers. The cost of the tragedy was quantified in 3 devastating figures: 7 lives lost, 32 months grounded, and over $1.2 billion spent on the investigation and subsequent redesign. The grounding of the entire Space Shuttle fleet lasted for 32 months, almost 3 years of zero access to space. This forced delay immediately crippled America's strategic and scientific ambitions. Satellites slated for deployment were left marooned in hangars. Critical military payloads were backed up, creating a national security crisis. The entire scientific community, which relied on the shuttle for orbiting laboratories, watched its schedules collapse. The accident proved that the cost of avoiding the truth is always exponentially higher than the cost of addressing the problem immediately. The investigation itself, spearheaded by the Rogers Commission, was a monumental undertaking, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. Teams of engineers and technicians were forced to review every one of the estimated $25,000 flight components across the entire shuttle fleet. The photo, the ultimate symbol of the failure, triggered a systematic dismantling and rebuilding of the entire program's philosophical foundation. The strategic outcome was the final, inescapable realization that the integrity of the machine was inseparable from the integrity of the people managing it. Before the disaster, NASA managers had privately estimated the risk of a catastrophic shuttle failure at a near impossible 1 in 100,000. The final findings of the Commission, confirmed by the data that had been ignored, adjusted that figure dramatically, placing the actual risk closer to 1 in 100. This brutal correction shattered the agency's credibility and forced a worldwide reckoning with the dangers of spaceflight. The public had been sold a narrative of seamless, risk-free transport. The image of the smiling crew had reinforced that lie. The consequence was a fundamental collapse of public trust. The long-term impact changed the global architecture of space travel. The Challenger disaster accelerated the reliance on unmanned, expendable rockets, a technology the US had previously marginalized in favor of the reusable shuttle. It was a strategic retreat, a quiet admission that the concept of the shuttle as a routine, low-cost space truck was fatally flawed. The tragedy not only stopped the shuttle program for nearly 3 years, but it permanently altered the operational philosophy of every spacefaring nation, proving that the price of ignoring engineering dissent is measured in human lives and billions of dollars. The simple photograph of those 7 faces became the most expensive visual in space history. For years after the tragedy, a comforting public myth settled over the nation. The story told was one of unavoidable chance. The narrative was simple. No one could have seen it coming. It was a failure of the unknown. This myth allowed the public to feel sadness without demanding fundamental accountability. It allowed the system to survive without confronting its deepest failures. But the myth was a lie. The correction delivered by the Rogers Commission was a brutal exercise in intellectual honesty. The failure was not one of the unknown, it was a failure of ignored data. The warnings about the O-rings were not only documented, but they were documented for years. The crucial information, the precise data points showing the loss of resilience below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, was clear, accessible, and deliberately overridden. The greatest challenge for the investigators was not finding the truth. It was debunking the comforting narrative that the whole system had adopted. The smiling photograph became the ultimate visual tool for this debunking. The smiles, once interpreted as innocence and ignorance of the danger, were reclassified. They were not evidence of the crew being unaware of a flaw, they were evidence of compliance under pressure. They were performing a role that the institution demanded, the role of the confident, willing participant in a scheduled event. The real moral of the story is not that a part failed. The true correction is that a culture of obedience silenced the individuals who knew the truth. The engineers who had the data were pressured until their professional judgment yielded to the administrative deadline. The Challenger disaster was not a freak accident. It was the predictable consequence of a long-standing organizational disease that valued the illusion of infallibility over the hard reality of risk. History does not hide its warnings. It merely records the faces of those who chose to ignore them. The shuttle program has long since ended, but the image remains. The high-resolution photograph of the 7 astronauts, forever framed in their bright blue suits, is now a ghost of accountability. It hangs, not in a museum of triumph, but in the memory of the nation, time-stamped forever. January 28, 1986, 11:38 a.m. We remember them, and we should, for their courage, their ambition, and the inherent risk they accepted. But the legacy of Challenger is not ultimately found in the sky. It is found in that piece of film. The mission was a profound failure of the machine. The legacy is a painful but enduring lesson for the people who build and manage the machine. That lesson is simple. Listen to the data. The true danger to any complex, high-risk endeavor is not the unexpected flaw, but the expected truth that is deemed inconvenient. The most important components in any system are the individuals who are willing to speak up, even when their warning threatens to derail the schedule and shatter the perfect image. The story is not about the fire and smoke. It is about the courage to see. It is about the moral obligation to prioritize physical reality over manufactured optimism. The photo survives not to mourn the loss, but to ensure that the system never again mistakes its own confident self-image for technical safety. Get comfortable now, relax, and think about the last time you saw a problem at work that was easier to ignore than to fix. Because the ultimate truth is this: history doesn't hide its warnings, it captures them smiling.